Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a massive, multi-trillion-dollar engine of global trade that honestly often flies completely under the radar. We are talking about factoring. Also known as a commercial debt purchase or a discounting agreement, it's essentially a financial instrument that lets businesses trade their waiting time for immediate upfront cash. If you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how global supply chains keep humming along even when money is tied up for months on end, well, you're in exactly the right place.
Think about this totally relatable, universal business nightmare. You just landed a massive contract, you delivered the goods flawlessly, and your profit margins, they look absolutely incredible on paper. But there's a catch. Your customer has 60, 90, maybe even 120 days to actually pay the invoice. So your balance sheet says you're thriving, but your bank account is sitting at zero. How on earth do you pay your team? How do you buy raw materials for the next gig? This brutal gap between making a sale and actually getting the cash is where so many otherwise healthy businesses just hit a wall.
So, to figure out how companies bridge this dangerous liquidity gap, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll hit the factoring concept, then the mechanics of the contract, types of factoring, strategic business advantages, factoring in Islamic finance, and finally, the global market and growth.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the factoring concept.
At its core, factoring is surprisingly straightforward. It's simply a commercial entity selling its uncollected invoices, those deferred payment debts, to a specialized third party for an upfront payment. And this creates a classic tripartite relationship. First, you've got the factor. This is usually a specialized financial institution or bank that buys the claims and provides the cash. Second is the seller or the client who delivered the goods and desperately needs the liquidity. And third, you have the debtor. That's the original customer who bought the goods and is now legally obligated to pay the invoice directly to the factor instead of the seller. Moving right along to Section 2, let's look at the actual mechanics of the contract. So how does this actually work day to day? It's a pretty slick three-step operation. Step 1, the seller submits their outstanding invoices to the factoring company, and the factor runs a check on the creditworthiness of the debtors. Step 2, once approved, the factor wires an immediate cash advance, usually somewhere between 70 and 90% of the total invoice value. Boom! Instant liquidity. Finally, Step 3, when the payment maturity date rolls around, the factor collects the full amount from the debtor and remits the remaining balance back to the seller, obviously after deducting their commission and administrative expenses. Now for Section 3, the different types of factoring. Not all factoring agreements are identical. It really comes down to who holds the bag if things go south. In recourse factoring, if the ultimate debtor goes belly up and can't pay, the seller is still liable. They literally have to hand the money back to the factor. But non-recourse factoring is a totally different beast. Here, the factoring company takes on the full risk of non-payment. If the debtor defaults, that's the factor's problem. And honestly, a lot of financial experts consider this complete transfer of risk to be the true essence of a factoring contract. We also split factoring up by geography. Domestic factoring is pretty simple. Everyone's in the same country, playing by the same national laws, like Egyptian Law Mo 176 of 2018, for instance. But international factoring, that facilitates complex cross-border trade where you're dealing with different countries and legal systems. To keep this from turning into total chaos, international factoring relies heavily on the 1988 Ottawa Convention, which laid down a super important unified legal framework for global trades. That brings us to Section 4, Strategic Business Advantages. Why do businesses love this so much? Well, obviously, there's the improved cash flow without the wait. But crucially, the factoring company takes on a ton of administrative headaches. They handle the debt management, the legal collection process, the accounting, the whole shebang. Plus, especially with non-recourse contracts, you get solid protection against credit risk. You are essentially outsourcing your entire accounts receivable department to a specialized pro. And here is maybe the biggest game changer of all. Factoring is not alone. Because it is legally recorded as a sale of financial assets, meaning you're literally selling the invoice, it does not show up as a liability or a debt on your balance sheet. This means a business can access millions in working capital without touching its debt ratios. It keeps the company looking incredibly healthy to investors and future partners. Let's pivot slightly for Section 5, factoring in Islamic finance. Traditional factoring actually sparks a really fascinating jurisprudential debate within Islamic finance. Because you are essentially selling debt for a discounted cash amount, scholars point out it triggers Sharia concerns. Specifically, riba al-nasiya, which is usury of delay, and riba al-fadl, usury of excess. The core issue is that exchanging a smaller chunk of upfront cash for a larger chunk of deferred cash is traditionally seen as explicit usury. Plus, there's the whole issue of gharar, or uncertainty, regarding whether the debts will actually be collected. But businesses operating under Islamic finance principles still desperately need liquidity, right? To fix this, Islamic jurists developed some really clever Sharia-compliant models. Instead of discounting debt, they use alternative contract mechanisms. Wakala bi-Ajr sets up the factor as an agent performing collection services for a set fee. Hawala is a compliant transfer of debt, and murabaha or tawarrug involves structuring the whole thing around the buying and selling of actual commodities, which effectively removes the usury element while still getting cash to the business. And this isn't just the theory in a textbook, it's happening right now in the real world. Take Indonesia, for example. The Wakala bi-Ajr and Hawala contracts are heavily utilized there to provide factoring services. This was completely greenlit and formalized by a 2008 fatwa issued by their National Sharia Council, allowing companies to ethically unlock liquidity.
Finally, Section 6, zooming out to the global market and its growth.
To really understand the sheer scale of this, look at this number. In 2022, the global factoring market hit a mind-blowing $3.57 trillion. That's trillion with a T. This isn't some niche financial trick, it's literally the lifeblood pumping through global commerce. If you carve up that 3.5 trillion by sector, manufacturing is the absolute heavyweight, which makes total sense, right? Manufacturing requires massive upfront spending on raw materials and labor, followed by agonizing waits for payment. Following closely behind manufacturing, you've got the transport and logistics sectors, construction, and IT.
Regionally, Europe totally dominates the space, commanding a massive 68% of the global market, with France leading the charge. The Asia-Pacific region holds about a quarter of the pie, at 24%, heavily driven by China, which is essentially the single largest national market on Earth for factoring. South America, North America, and Africa represent much smaller slices, which tells us there is still massive, untapped growth potential in those markets.
So, there you have it. Factoring basically lets businesses survive today on the money they'll earn tomorrow. It bridges the gaps, absorbs the risks, and keeps international trade moving. As global supply chains get more complex and traditional bank loans get stricter, it leaves us with a pretty big question. How will alternative financing instruments, like factoring, continue to reshape the global supply chain of the future? It's definitely something every business owner and investor needs to be thinking about. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.